The waitress looked at my daughter before answering me. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. Not inside the restaurant, inside the way people were starting to see me. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Sandra invited me to lunch at a small café near the riverfront, the kind of quiet place older couples usually fill during weekday afternoons. Warm lighting, soft music, rain against the windows. Normal. I ordered coffee after finishing my soup. Nothing unusual, just coffee. But when the waitress nodded and turned toward Sandra instead of me, something cold moved slowly through my chest. "Is she still okay to have caffeine?" the waitress asked quietly. "Is she?" Not "would you like cream? Would you like decaf? Is she still okay?" Sandra froze immediately. The waitress noticed too late that something was wrong. "Oh, I'm sorry, I just thought." "What exactly did you think?" I asked softly. The poor girl looked horrified suddenly. Not cruel, not mocking, careful, always careful now. Sandra stepped in quickly. "It's fine, fine, interesting word, not inappropriate, not humiliating, fine." I stared at my daughter. "How does she know you?" Sandra looked away instantly. My stomach tightened. "You've been here before." Another silence. Too long, then quietly. "Sometimes." Sometimes. The waitress disappeared toward the coffee station, looking visibly panicked now. But I barely noticed her anymore, because suddenly my attention locked entirely onto Sandra. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing." "No." I lowered my voice carefully. "Do not do that." The room stayed completely still. "You knew exactly what she meant." Sandra rubbed her forehead softly. "She recognized me from before. And she remembered asking whether you should avoid caffeine after your blood pressure scare." Blood pressure scare. Interesting phrase. Not one elevated reading during a stressful month. Scare. Fear wrapped around ordinary medical reality until it sounded dramatic enough to justify concern. I stared at my daughter carefully. "You discussed my medical information with restaurant staff." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Sandra sighed heavily. "You felt dizzy here once." I blinked. "That was 6 months ago. You nearly fainted." "I stood up too fast. Your blood pressure spiked." One afternoon, that was all it took now. One dizzy moment transformed into institutional memory. The waitress returned carefully, carrying my coffee with both hands. Not casually, carefully. As though she were serving medication instead of coffee. She placed the cup gently in front of me, then looked toward Sandra again. "Let me know if she needs anything else." She, not Mrs. Turner. "Not you, she," and again she said it to my daughter, not me. The humiliation burned slowly through my chest. I looked directly at the waitress. "I'm sitting right here." Her face drained immediately. "I'm so sorry." And I believed her. That was the tragedy, no cruelty, no malice. Just fear spreading quietly through ordinary social interactions until older adults slowly stop existing as full authorities over themselves. Sandra reached for her purse quickly. "Mom, please don't make this bigger than it is." Bigger than it is. Interesting phrase, as though humiliation itself already sounded disproportionate. I stared down at the coffee cup sitting untouched in front of me. Steam curled softly upward beneath the cafe lights. Such an ordinary thing, yet suddenly drinking coffee felt strangely political. Like a test, like evidence, then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 months earlier, Sandra asking casually, "Are you still drinking full-strength coffee?" At the time I laughed because she sounded overly cautious. Now my stomach tightened. No. She had already started monitoring my habits. I looked back up slowly. "How many people know about my blood pressure?" Sandra hesitated too long. "What does that mean?" The waitress remembered. She just overheard things. Overheard, interesting word, not informed, not warned, overheard. I suddenly remembered Sandra speaking quietly to the manager during my dizzy spell months earlier, while I sat embarrassed near the restroom. At the time I assumed she was explaining the situation politely. Now I wasn't so sure. "What exactly did you tell them that day?" Sandra looked exhausted suddenly. "That you had some memory problems recently." The cafe seemed to tilt slightly around me. "What? You were confused after the dizziness." I was embarrassed. You kept repeating yourself. There it was again, repeated yourself, not frightened, not shaken, symptom language. Fear had quietly rewritten ordinary human vulnerability into warning signs again. I sat completely still, while voices and silverware blurred softly around us. One dizzy afternoon. One repeated question. One elevated blood pressure reading. And suddenly strangers in cafes were quietly checking whether I was allowed to drink coffee. Then Sandra whispered something that hollowed me completely. I just didn't want them serving you something dangerous if another episode happened. Dangerous. Not coffee, me. I stared at my daughter across the small cafe table while rain pressed softly against the windows behind her. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. The waitress was not the problem. The real problem was that somewhere along the way, my daughter had started introducing me to the world as someone who needed supervision. I did not drink the coffee. Not because I feared caffeine. Because suddenly lifting the cup felt humiliating. Every movement now carried invisible observation attached to it. Would I shake? Would I seem confused? Would Sandra watch too carefully? The waitress kept glancing toward our table afterward. Not rudely, worriedly. That somehow felt worse. I pushed the cup gently aside. Sandra noticed immediately. You always love their coffee. Always, interesting word, not today, not lately. Always, I looked at her quietly. I don't feel like being evaluated while drinking it. The room between us went completely still, because finally I said the real thing aloud. Not concern, evaluation. Sandra rubbed both hands together softly. You're taking this the wrong way. Wrong way. Another dangerous phrase, as though emotional reaction itself already sounded irrational. I leaned back slowly in the booth. Am I? She hesitated, then quietly. You scared me that day. There it was again, fear, always fear, never control, never humiliation, fear. I remembered the afternoon clearly now. The cafe had been crowded, too warm. I stood up too quickly after lunch and the room tilted for a moment. Normal dizziness, human dizziness. But older adults experience those moments differently. Publicly, suspiciously, Sandra lowered her voice carefully. You looked confused afterward. I was embarrassed. You asked twice whether we already paid. One question repeated twice. Every ordinary human moment slowly collected into narrative again. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. After the dizzy spell, the manager brought me water and asked Sandra quietly, does she need medical supervision? At the time, I thought he was simply being kind. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, Sandra must have answered something memorable enough for the waitress to still recognize me 6 months later. How often do you come here? I asked softly. Sandra looked surprised by the question. Sometimes after work, and they remember me. Silence. Then quietly, you made an impression. Impression, interesting word, not scene, not emergency. Impression, I suddenly realized something horrifying. My worst moment in that cafe had quietly become part of staff memory. Not Elaine Turner, not regular customer. The older woman with health concerns. I looked toward the waitress wiping menus near the counter. She looked young, maybe 22, young enough to believe concern automatically meant kindness. I remembered being that age once. Before aging taught me how quickly compassion can slide into quiet paternalism. Sandra reached carefully toward my hand. I pulled away automatically. The hurt on her face appeared instantly. Not anger, devastation, because finally she understood something too. Every comforting gesture now carried traces of supervision. That was the damage. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that made my stomach turn cold. I told them to call me if you ever seemed unwell again. The cafe noise disappeared around me for one long second. What? I just wanted someone nearby in case something happened. Something, always something. Fear survives comfortably inside vague future disasters because no one can prove they will never happen. I stared at my daughter. You instructed restaurant staff to monitor me. It wasn't like that. Then what exactly was it like? Sandra looked exhausted suddenly. You were alone all the time after Dad died. Richard again, always Richard. Grief had quietly become the foundation underneath every concern. You stopped eating properly. I lost my husband. You looked tired constantly. I was grieving. You forgot things. One thing, more than one. There it was again. Every normal human mistake carefully counted until it sounded pathological. I suddenly realized something terrifying. My daughter had stopped interpreting my behavior emotionally. Now she interpreted it diagnostically. That was the real shift. The waitress approached again carefully. Would you like a fresh coffee? Fresh, not refill, because I never touched the first one. Sandra answered before I could speak. She probably shouldn't have another. The room went completely silent. The waitress nodded automatically. Of course, not because of me. Because my daughter sounded authoritative, I stared at Sandra slowly. You answered for me. Her face flushed instantly. I just meant because your blood pressure. My doctor did not ban coffee. You said caffeine makes you anxious sometimes. I said that once. One sentence. One observation. One difficult afternoon. And suddenly strangers began treating my daughter like final authority over my body. The waitress walked away quickly now, clearly uncomfortable. But the damage was already done. I sat very still staring at the untouched coffee cup while humiliation burned slowly through my chest. Then another realization surfaced. This was not the first time Sandra answered for me publicly. 3 weeks earlier at the pharmacy, she prefers the smaller pills. At the grocery store, she gets confused with the self-checkout sometimes. Tiny moments. Tiny social adjustments repeated until people stopped looking directly at me entirely. I looked toward the cafe windows where rain slid softly down the glass. Normal afternoon, normal restaurant. Yet somehow my entire identity inside this place had quietly shifted from woman to responsibility. Then Sandra whispered something that hollowed me completely. I thought if people knew to watch out for you, you'd be safer. Safer, always safer. Fear wrapped in love becomes almost impossible to challenge cleanly. Because somewhere deep down, everyone believes safety sounds compassionate, even when it slowly erases someone's dignity one interaction at a time. I finally stood up slowly from the booth. The waitress looked toward us automatically, not at me, at Sandra, waiting for instruction. And perhaps the cruelest thing about growing older is this. Sometimes the people who love you become so frightened of your vulnerability, they accidentally teach the entire world to stop seeing you as fully capable long before anything is actually wrong. I stopped going to that cafe after that afternoon, not intentionally at first. I simply could not bear the thought of walking back into a room where people quietly watched whether I was allowed to drink coffee. That was the humiliating part, not concern itself, permission. For weeks afterward, every small public interaction started feeling contaminated somehow. At the pharmacy, I noticed the cashier glance toward Michael when I asked a question about medication timing. At the grocery store, Sandra automatically answered when the cashier asked whether I wanted paper or plastic bags. Tiny moments, tiny redirects, yet each one felt enormous now. Because once you notice people slowly speaking around you instead of to you, you can never fully stop noticing it again. One rainy Tuesday morning, I went alone to a diner across town hoping anonymity would feel comforting. The waitress there did not know me. That mattered deeply. She handed me a menu. Asked me directly what I wanted. Called me ma'am instead of she. Such ordinary interactions. Yet I nearly cried ordering coffee because no one looked toward another adult for approval first. I sat near the window stirring cream into the cup slowly while rain moved softly against the glass outside. Normal coffee, normal table, normal dignity. Then my phone buzzed. Sandra. For one terrible second, panic flashed through me automatically. Not because anything happened, because my body now associated concern with surveillance. I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. Then another realization hit me hard enough to make my stomach turn. Fear had moved inside me too. That was the real damage, not the cafe. Not the waitress. Conditioning. For months now, I had started monitoring myself constantly through the imagined eyes of other people. Was I repeating stories? Did I seem confused? Should I order decaf? The diner waitress returned with a refill pot. Want more coffee, sweetheart? Just that. No hesitation. No glance toward family. I almost laughed from relief. Yes, I whispered. She filled the cup carelessly, casually, normally. And suddenly I realized how starved I had become for ordinary treatment. That evening, Michael stopped by unexpectedly carrying groceries again. Of course he did. The family orbited around me constantly, now like satellites monitoring unstable weather. The moment he entered the kitchen, he frowned slightly. You look tired. There it was again. Observation, not greeting, not conversation, assessment. I set the grocery bag onto the counter harder than intended. I had coffee today, Michael blinked. What? I drank 2 full cups. Silence, then cautiously, okay. Not sounds nice. Did you enjoy it? Just cautious neutrality. I laughed softly, brokenly. You all act like caffeine is morphine now. Michael rubbed his forehead immediately. No one thinks that. No, I stared at him carefully. Your sister told restaurant staff to monitor me. His face changed slightly, not surprise, recognition. You knew, she was worried after the dizziness. One dizzy afternoon, 6 months ago, and somehow it still existed socially like permanent evidence. I leaned against the kitchen counter while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Always rain lately. Do you know what's strange? I asked quietly. Michael remained silent. I don't remember the dizziness itself being traumatic. The room stayed completely still. Do you know what actually traumatized me? What? The way everyone looked at me afterward. There it was, the real wound underneath everything, not health fear, identity shift. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. The manager, the waitress, Sandra. I looked directly at my son. They all started seeing me as fragile. Michael sat down slowly at the kitchen table. You did scare us. Again, always fear, never humiliation, never dignity, fear. Then he quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. After Dad died, his voice cracked slightly. I kept imagining losing you too. Richard again, always Richard. Grief had quietly transformed into anticipatory panic inside my children. I sat across from him heavily. That still doesn't give you permission to turn me into a public supervision project. The sentence landed hard. I saw it immediately in his face, because somewhere deep down, he already knew. Not consciously, perhaps, but enough. Enough to feel shame every time restaurant staff looked toward Sandra instead of me. Then Michael whispered, We thought if more people watched out for you, you'd be safer. Watched out for you. Interesting phrase, not respected, not trusted. Watched. I suddenly realized something terrifying. My children had quietly expanded supervision outward into the world itself. The cafe staff, the pharmacist, neighbors, store clerks. Fear spreading socially, one careful conversation at a time. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, Mrs. Ellis from church asking, Do your children still let you drive at night? At the time I laughed because the question sounded ridiculous. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. People had been discussing me, not maliciously perhaps, but casually, concernedly, as though I had already shifted categories from adult woman into vulnerable situation. I looked down at the kitchen table while silence settled heavily between us, then quietly asked, How many people have you all warned about me? Michael's face drained immediately. And suddenly, I knew the answer was larger than I wanted to hear. Michael did not answer immediately. That silence frightened me more than any explanation could have. Finally he whispered, Not warned. Interesting, not no one, that's ridiculous. Immediately he corrected the language instead. We just mention things. The softest possible phrase for quietly reshaping how other people see someone. I stared at my son carefully. To who? He rubbed his forehead tiredly. Neighbors sometimes. Sandra talked to the cafe staff after the dizziness. Claire mentioned your blood pressure at church. Church. My chest tightened instantly. Of course, the prayer circles, the casserole deliveries. The gentle, concerned smiles lately. Suddenly everything rearranged itself. I remembered Mrs. Ellis insisting on carrying my coffee during fellowship breakfast. The pastor asking whether I still felt comfortable living independently. People offering rides I never requested. At the time, I thought everyone was simply kind after Richard's death. Now my stomach turned cold. No, they had been briefed. Not dramatically, not maliciously, just carefully enough that concern quietly spread through the community. I sat very still. You turned me into someone people monitor. Michael's face crumpled immediately. That wasn't our intention. No, I believed him. That was the tragedy. Fear rarely announces itself as control. It arrives disguised as responsibility. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. After the cafe incident, Sandra thought maybe public places should know in case you needed help. Needed help. Not became dizzy once. Not had a stressful moment. Needed help. I suddenly remembered another strange interaction. April, the librarian lowering her voice and asking, "Should we call your daughter if you seem disoriented again?" Disoriented. At the time I laughed because I thought she confused me with someone else. God help me. Maybe Sandra spoke to the library too. How many places know about this? I asked softly. Michael looked exhausted suddenly. I don't know. No, I think suddenly he did know, or at least enough to understand the scale now. I stood and walked slowly toward the living room because suddenly the kitchen felt unbearable. The hallway photographs blurred slightly as I passed them. Richard smiling beside the lake. Sandra graduating college. Michael holding Ethan as a baby. An entire life spent becoming someone. And now, quietly, socially, I was becoming something else. A concern, a situation. Someone people gently watched. The realization made me feel physically ill. Michael followed slowly behind me. Mom, I turned sharply. Do you know what the cruelest part is? He remained silent. For months, every time someone looked at me strangely, I thought maybe I really was becoming confused. The room went completely still, because there it was again, the real damage. Not public concern, self-doubt. Fear repeated often enough eventually moves inside older adults too. I pointed toward the living room window. When the cashier spoke slowly to me, when neighbors offered rides, when the pharmacist repeated instructions twice, my voice cracked slightly. I blamed myself instead of realizing people were responding to stories about me. Michael covered his face briefly, not defensive, not careful, ashamed. I never wanted that. No, I knew. That somehow hurt worse. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. We thought if people understood the situation, they'd protect you. The situation. Interesting phrase, not my mother. Not Elaine, situation. I stared at him silently, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. My children had slowly started discussing me socially the way people discuss vulnerable relatives privately. Not cruelly, not mockingly, compassionately. That made it infinitely more dangerous. Compassion mixed with fear becomes nearly impossible to challenge without sounding unstable. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 months earlier at church, accidentally forgetting one verse during hymn practice. Mrs. Ellis immediately squeezing my hand gently and saying, "That's okay, dear, not Elaine, dear." At the time I thought she was being sweet. Now my stomach tightened. No, she was reassuring someone she already viewed as fragile. I sat heavily in Richard's old armchair while rain pressed softly against the windows. Normal rain, normal evening. Yet suddenly, the entire world outside this house felt altered. Not because strangers changed, because narratives changed. And once narratives shift, every interaction shifts quietly afterward too. Then Michael admitted something else. The cafe manager asked Sandra whether you should avoid being alone after the dizziness. The room went cold. What? She told him it was probably just stress and blood pressure. Probably just. Interesting phrase, not definitely fine, not normal, probably, enough uncertainty to leave concern alive. I stared down at my hands, one dizzy spell, one repeated question, one elevated blood pressure reading. And suddenly managers, waitresses, neighbors, and church members quietly started viewing me through the lens of possible decline. Fear had spread farther than I ever realized. Then Michael quietly sat across from me and whispered, "I think we stopped understanding how visible all this became for you." Visible, exactly. That was the humiliation underneath everything. Not private family concern, public identity transformation. The gradual social shift, where people stop seeing an older woman as fully authoritative over herself and begin seeing her as someone requiring collective awareness. And perhaps the cruelest thing about growing older is this. Sometimes the people who love you most become so frightened of losing you, they accidentally teach the entire world to start looking at you like you are already halfway gone. For several weeks after that conversation, I avoided nearly everyone, not dramatically, quietly. I stopped staying after church services, stopped eating at restaurants, stopped lingering in grocery aisles talking to neighbors. Because suddenly, every interaction carried invisible questions attached to it. Does she seem confused today? Should someone walk her home? Is she still safe alone? That was the real prison fear creates, not supervision itself, hyper-awareness. The following Friday, Susan forced me out of the house, not gently either. "You are coming to lunch," she announced over the phone, "and not at that cafe." I almost refused, then realized something horrifying. I had started reorganizing my own life around other people's concern. That frightened me more than the waitress ever had, so I agreed. Susan took me to a noisy little diner across town where nobody knew my name. No one recognized Sandra. No one remembered dizziness. No one watched me carefully. The waitress called me honey, poured terrible coffee, and forgot our toast twice. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. At one point, I accidentally knocked over my water glass while reaching for sugar packets. The glass tipped sideways, and water spread across the table instantly. For one horrible second, panic flashed through me automatically. There, proof, evidence, I actually looked around waiting for concern. Careful smiles, gentle voices. Someone asking whether I felt okay. Instead, the waitress laughed lightly, tossed down extra napkins, and said, "Happens all the time." That simple sentence nearly made me cry. Happens all the time. Not concerning, not unusual. Human. I sat there blotting water with napkins while something inside my chest loosened for the first time in months. Susan watched me carefully across the booth. Then quietly asked, "You thought people would look at you differently, didn't you?" I stared at the wet tablecloth. Yes, because that was the damage. Once enough people start interpreting your ordinary mistakes as warning signs, you begin doing it too. Then Susan said something that stayed with me permanently. "Fear taught your children to watch you instead of simply seeing you." The room went still, because finally someone understood the exact difference. Watching, seeing. Those are not the same thing at all. That evening, Sandra called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded exhausted immediately. "Mrs. Ellis asked me today whether you're doing better." Better. Interesting word. Not happy, not healthy, better. As though I had quietly become a condition people tracked collectively, I closed my eyes briefly. "What exactly did you tell church people?" Sandra hesitated too long. "Just that you've been struggling after Dad died." Struggling, not grieving, struggling. One word repeated often enough slowly changes social identity. I sat quietly at the kitchen table while dusk settled softly across the house. "Do you know what hurts most?" I whispered. Sandra remained silent. I wasn't even part of the conversations shaping how people saw me. The line stayed completely still, because it was true. Neighbors, church members, cafe staff. Store clerks. People quietly adjusting around narratives about me while I continued living ordinary life inside those same spaces. Then Sandra quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. "The first time Mrs. Ellis offered to drive you home," her voice cracked slightly, "I felt relieved." Relieved, again, not uncomfortable, not embarrassed, relieved. I stared toward the dark kitchen window. There it is. What? You all started feeling safer when other people monitored me too. The silence afterward answered everything. Fear had expanded outward socially until supervision became communal. Not intentionally perhaps, but naturally. Because concern spreads quickly through communities built around caregiving and aging. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, the pharmacist speaking unusually slowly while explaining dosage instructions. At the time, I felt insulted. Now I realized something worse. He probably believed he was being compassionate. That was the terrifying part, not cruelty, paternalism. Soft, smiling, socially approved paternalism. The next Sunday, I forced myself to return to church fellowship breakfast. Not because I wanted to, because I refused to disappear quietly from my own life. The room smelled like coffee and pancakes. Normal church sounds, normal conversations, yet my chest tightened the moment Mrs. Ellis spotted me. "Oh, good," she said warmly. "You're looking much stronger lately." Stronger, not happier. Not rested, stronger, as though recovery itself had quietly become expected. I smiled politely anyway, then deliberately poured myself full-strength coffee directly in front of her. My hand shook slightly, lifting the pot. For one terrible second, panic surged again. There, evidence. Then Mrs. Ellis simply continued buttering her toast. Nothing happened. The world did not collapse. No one gasped. No one intervened. I sat down, slowly holding the coffee cup between both hands. Hot, ordinary, mine. And suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not physical vulnerability itself. It is how quickly ordinary human moments begin collecting social meaning once enough people become afraid for you. One repeated story, one dizzy afternoon, one trembling hand, tiny moments transformed into communal concern. And sometimes, by the time the people who love you realize they went too far, you have already spent months learning what it feels like to become fragile in everyone else's eyes before you ever truly became fragile. At all. Winter faded slowly after that. The ice melted from sidewalks. The heavy coats disappeared. People stopped asking whether I was holding up okay every time they saw me. At least most of them did. But once you become aware of how people quietly adjust around older adults, you never completely stop noticing it. That awareness stays, like background noise. One afternoon in early spring, I returned to the riverfront cafe alone for the first time. Not because I missed the food, because eventually I realized something important. If I avoided every place touched by other people's fear, my world would keep shrinking quietly until I disappeared inside it myself. The waitress from that afternoon still worked there. The moment she saw me enter, panic flashed visibly across her face. Not cruelty, memory, she remembered. For one brief second, I almost turned around and walked back out. Then I forced myself toward the same booth near the windows. Rain again outside. Always rain in these stories somehow. The waitress approached carefully, holding a menu. "I'm really sorry about last time," she whispered immediately. There it was, not denial, not confusion, recognition. I looked up at her. "You thought you were helping." Her shoulders relaxed slightly with relief. Yes, I believed her. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Almost everyone involved believed they were helping. The waitress shifted awkwardly beside the table. "Your daughter sounded worried." Worried. Again, always worried. Never wrong. I folded my hands carefully around the menu. "Do you know what happened after that day?" She shook her head softly. "I stopped drinking coffee in public for a while." Her face fell instantly, not defensive, not careful, heartbroken. Because finally she understood the actual consequence. Not embarrassment. Conditioning. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to supervise themselves too. The waitress sat down briefly across from me despite clearly knowing she probably should not. "I lost my grandmother last year," she whispered. There it was. The hidden grief underneath everything again. Fear almost always begins somewhere real. "She forgot to turn the stove off one night," the waitress continued softly. After that, everyone watched her constantly. Watched. Interesting word. Not supported, not loved. Watched. I stared out the window while rain slid softly down the glass. "And eventually," I whispered, "you stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a situation." The room stayed silent, because she understood immediately. not professionally, not theoretically. Humanly, then something unexpected happened. The waitress smiled slightly and held up the coffee pot. Regular coffee? Not, are you allowed? Should you avoid caffeine? Regular coffee. I nearly cried right there in the booth. Yes, she poured carelessly, normally, without caution, such a tiny moment, yet it felt enormous, because dignity often returns quietly too. One ordinary interaction at a time. Halfway through lunch, Sandra arrived unexpectedly. I never learned whether the waitress called her, or whether coincidence simply decided to torment me one final time. The moment Sandra saw the coffee cup, she froze slightly. Then immediately corrected her expression. Too late, I saw it. The instinctive calculation, the automatic concern, not because she was cruel, because fear leaves habits behind. Sandra slid into the booth across from me carefully. I didn't know you were here. I nodded toward the cup. I'm having coffee. A brief silence. Then softly, I see that. Not criticism. Not approval, just awareness. Progress. The waitress approached cautiously. Would either of you like dessert? Sandra looked toward me automatically before answering. Then stopped herself mid-motion. Tiny moment, yet deeply important, because finally she noticed her own reflexes too. I ordered pie, full sugar, whipped cream. Sandra almost interrupted once when I reached for extra sugar packets. Again she stopped herself. Tiny corrections, tiny restorations, that is how trust rebuilds, not dramatically, consciously. After dessert, Sandra finally whispered, I still get scared sometimes. There it was, the truth underneath everything. Fear does not disappear simply because people realize they went too far. It leaves instincts behind. I stirred the last of my coffee quietly. So do I, she looked surprised. Why? I smiled sadly. Because now every time I forget something, part of me wonders whether everyone else was right. The sentence landed heavily between us, because there it was again. The deepest wound underneath everything. Not the waitress, not the café, identity distortion. For months, I learned to experience ordinary human imperfection through the lens of possible decline. Sandra's eyes filled immediately. We did that to you, partially, yes, but systems helped, communities helped, fear helped. No single person creates these situations alone. That is what makes them so dangerous. They grow quietly through concern, repetition, and social reinforcement until older adults slowly stop being seen clearly by the world around them. When we finally stood to leave, the waitress handed me the check directly. Not Sandra, me, such a tiny, ordinary gesture, yet my chest tightened painfully from relief anyway. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sidewalks glistened beneath soft evening light while people moved quietly along the riverfront. Normal life everywhere. I stood there beside my daughter breathing cold spring air and finally understood something terrifying. The most painful part of growing older is not physical decline itself. It is realizing how quickly fear can transform ordinary human vulnerability into public identity. One dizzy spell, one repeated story, one trembling hand. Tiny moments repeated socially until the world begins looking at you differently. And sometimes, by the time the people who love you finally understand they were wrong, you have already spent months learning what it feels like to slowly disappear inside everyone else's concern.